Welcome to another edition of Daily Airline News, focusing on the loss of Air India Flight 171. I'm Jeffrey Thomas, and I'm delighted to say joined once again by my co-host Richard Godfrey in Frankfurt. Good morning to you, Richard.
And good afternoon to you, Jeffrey.
So, viewers, we've got a really cracking episode for you today. It's called Deception. It's episode 220. We've seen the reports from the 91-year-old father of Captain Sumeet Sabuel. We have clearly stated with evidence that the pilots were doing everything possible to save the aircraft after dual engine shut down due to water ingress into the aft EE bay during rotation. We have also claimed with evidence that there was a possibility of an APU battery thermal runaway, explosion and fire. Both these issues point to maintenance failures by Air India. The preliminary report was written to prepare the way for this cover-up. In our episode today, we point out again that the preliminary report is incorrect, inconsistent, and is a misinformation campaign which raises more questions than it answers. So, Richard, from Jacqueline Jacobson, 6789, if you would go to what the preliminary report implies, the engines failed after the fuel switches were turned off. This is intentionally deceptive. The families of the pilots and victims have begun a lawsuit to force the AAIB to reveal the entire CVR and FDR. I hope they win. Richard.
Yeah, well, I hope they win too. The AAIB India are apparently insistent that the Air India crash was caused by the captain as a murder-suicide. That is according to the captain's father. And the captain's 91-year-old father has written to the Indian authorities threatening to take them to court unless the statements are retracted. He has also written to the Airline Pilots Association in India and seeking their support, which was forthcoming. Apparently, the AAIB visited the captain's 91-year-old father on the pretext of wanting to offer condolences. They then informed the father that the captain switched the fuel to cutoff and deliberately caused the crash as a murder-suicide. There is no confirmation from the AAIB India of this visit or the allegations made. However, many reputable media sources all confirm that the visit took place. And Pushkaraj Sabharwal, the captain's father, has formally requested a Rule 12 investigation under the Indian rules, which allows a more formal or impartial probe by the government. He says the preliminary report has harmed his son's reputation, particularly due to insinuations about mental health and suicide. There are demands that selective leaks and media speculation be addressed. And excerpts from the father's letter have been published.
Mm. It's getting pretty hot there, isn't it?
It is indeed.
So at Lockheed Central, we've heard from Lockheed before, the human factor here is that one of them turned the switches off. What we have on this channel is collective fantasy that denies the obvious. Well, he obviously doesn't agree with us.
Quite obviously not. And we have stated the fuel switches were moved mechanically 105 times and physically 186 times. So, Loki Central, I think you are fantasizing and denying the obvious. The fact is that the dual engine failure QRH calls for the fuel switches to be recycled.
So Jason Etheridge, Richard said the industry experts say that the rat would provide hydraulic power within 6 seconds. From the preliminary report, the fuel switches are moved immediately thereafter, 080842. It goes on to say that the rat hydraulic pump began supplying hydraulic power at 080847. With the language and the plus or minus 1 second for the rat's timings, that would appear consistent with the rat deploying once both engines' fuel switches had been moved to cut-off. No indication was given in the preliminary report as to when full electrical power was provided by the rat, which industry experts say was 10 seconds, with Richard mentioning the best case being 9 seconds, given plus or minus 1 second. Can Richard please explain how this fits into his hypothesis?
Yeah, well, many thanks, Jason. And here is the explanation as how that fits the plausible hypothesis and the probable cause of the accident. And I think the first thing we have to recognize is that the preliminary report is inadequate, inaccurate, misleading, misinformation, and in some cases, incorrect. Let me give you some examples so we can go through the timing in a little more precision. We're showing a screenshot of the Air India Flight 171 takeoff roll, rotation, the takeoff, and the initial ascent, and then the following descent and crash. The takeoff roll was 2,227 meters long, and the rotation speed was 145.4 knots, IAS, not 153 knots as in the preliminary report. The takeoff speed was 157.4 knots, not 155 knots IAS as in the preliminary report. The maximum speed was 180.1 knots IAS, and it occurred at 080849, not at 080842, as in the preliminary report. So first of all, we need to get the correct and accurate data. And the preliminary report data does not align with Flight Radar 24 ADS-B data, nor with the airport security CCTV data. And when we hear the AAIB Indian officials visited the father of the captain under the pretext of offering condolences, just to say that the captain was suffering depression from his divorce 15 years previously and contemplating suicide from his mother's death 3 years previously, I'm sorry, I think they've lost the plot. My mother died 9 years ago, and I was divorced 25 years ago, but that does not make me a murder-suicide candidate.
And my dear mother passed away in 2015, and I was divorced in 2000 from my previous wife, and I'm far from suicidal. So it's complete, absolute nonsense.
It is absolute nonsense.
It's ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous. So Amand Julian 3195 says, according to the latest Mojo story video on Flight 171, the AAIB told the captain's father his son, the captain, turned off the fuel switches. The father says he is going to sue the AAIB. And Jeff Daniel 814, yes, this report is quite concerning. The persons interviewed highlighted previous maintenance issues on this specific aircraft, one which was covered in a report and one that was not. The one report dealt with an unexplained wow alarm that occurred on a previous flight but appears to have never been properly localized or accounted for, and that one seems to be very relevant to this crash event. Richard, your thoughts on those?
Yeah, well, there are three key issues raised by Amond and Jeff. Number one, the fuel switches were switched off mechanically and physically. But the next question is why? And in order to try and answer that, I would remind viewers that, first of all, the fuel switches were also switched back on. And secondly, the standard operating procedure following a dual engine shutdown is to recycle the fuel switches to ensure an engine relight sequence is commenced. And thirdly, I would point out that there was a successful dual engine relight, so it all seemed to work as it should do. The second point raised about the maintenance issues, the maintenance logs have not been published, and there is no confirmation that the FAA Airworthiness Directive 2016-1404 has been complied with regarding potable water leaks and requiring drip shields and sealing of water ingress into the EE bay. And it's also, there's no evidence that the following MPRM and the safety bulletins from Boeing have been complied with. And the third point they raise, the preliminary report states that the WOW sensors transitioned from ground to air at 08:08:39 UTC. So, if you believe the preliminary report, but Jeff raises a valid concern with his comment. Were the WOW sensors working satisfactorily, as stated in the preliminary report? And quite frankly, I'm not sure what we can believe from the Indian authorities in the AAIB preliminary report.
Hmm. So, still on the rat, Richard, Sky King Victor 2 Mike asks the following. The AAIB data showed rat deployment logged at 08:08:40 UTC and fuel cutoff discretes at 08:08:42 to 43 UTC. While it may appear that the rat deployed before the fuel issue, this is likely due to FDR sampling resolution, different signal paths, and the fact that rat deployed visually, ejection into the airstream, is not identical to when it stabilized usable power. Importantly, the FDR recording of fuel cutoff does not imply that the pilots physically moved the fuel switches. On the 787, there are several automated pathways that could result in both engines losing fuel simultaneously. 1. Electrical cascade spurious command. A bus failure would generate a spurious cutoff signal. Solenoid power loss. FSOVs are failsafe. Loss of DC bus power can cause them to snap shut. Rare FADEC FMU path simultaneous FADEC authority loss could halt fuel metering, very unlikely at takeoff. Rare TCMA intervention, TCMA can override FADEC under specific conditions, almost certainly not relevant for AI-171 since the aircraft was airborne. Thus, it is entirely possible for the engines to flame out and the rat to deploy automatically without any manual switch action. The sequence of events should be seen as a near simultaneous cascade: fuel cutoff, automated or logical, engines lose VFSG output, electrical collapse, rat deployment within a few seconds. The apparent mirror inversion in timestamps is consistent with the FDR video logging nuances. Your point on pilot confusion is highly probable. At around 08:08:42 UTC established, CVR captures pilot confusion, sudden chaos. CVR captures why did you cut off the fuel? I didn't. This likely shows crew confusion amidst sudden fuel supply down. Possibly ICAS indication fuel flow zero, indicative of shock disbelief. It could well be a decision paralysis scenario. It could be that those switches were moved not in panic but in protocol in response to sudden tsunami of alerts, engines spooling down, and a cockpit stripped of its usual cues. Hope this clarifies the technical sequence and why RAT deployment and fuel cutoff can appear slightly out of order sometimes while still remaining fully consistent with the 787 system's logic and the crew likely traumatized with the sudden situation. Thanks for bringing this up. Interesting.
Yeah. Well, Sky King, you raise a number of important points and you suggest possible or in part even rare events that may have happened. I think I need to correct one statement you have in quotes, and you say, "Why did you cut off the fuel?" question mark in quotes. Well, the word fuel is not used in the preliminary report. It simply just says, "Why did you cut off?" So, was it referring to fuel or to the displays and instruments in front of the pilot or something else? You say the pilots were traumatized with the sudden situation. And I'm not sure that is correct because pilots are trained to expect one engine inoperative, an OEI, on takeoff. And the big question is, in this situation, we had a dual engine inoperative, and they don't go through similar training in the simulator as often on a dual engine inoperative on takeoff as they do on the single engine OEI. And pilots are not trained to expect both engines to fail on takeoff. This is an exceedingly rare event, and it happened on Air India. But the pilots reacted in accordance with the standard non-normal procedure for a dual engine failure. You state the fuel cutoff does not imply the pilots physically moved the fuel switches. I agree, it doesn't give the evidence, but I still believe the fuel switches were physically moved. And I offer three reasons for that view. Number one, that is what you're supposed to do in the event of a dual engine shutdown. You're supposed to recycle the fuel switches. And number two, the RAT was deployed and takes around 10 seconds to come online electrically. And meanwhile, the main battery provides power, but the pilots would have known that that does not support a dual engine relight. And the APU was not available, and the auto start sequence was initiated, but they also knew that would take 60 to 90 seconds to come online. So a Boeing 787 is not designed to recover from a dual engine shutdown at 180 knots or thereabouts and 200 feet above the ground directly after takeoff. You indicate four possible electrical or system failures that could cause a dual engine shutdown. But we also know the engines were both successfully relit. So the FADEC and the TCMA may have had a glitch, but they were then working satisfactorily for the relight. So that, as you point out, those scenarios we can take off the list. But the first two scenarios that you point out are both possible and plausible.
Right. Ivan Kuznetsov, 14N, I4N. Why would a pilot wait 10 seconds to cycle the fuel switches at such a critically low altitude? Just doesn't make sense.
Well, the pilot waited until the rat was deployed because the rat will support a dual engine relight, and that takes around 10 seconds before the rat essential electrical bus comes online.
Hmm. Now, Doug Swanson, 9142, listen to episode 215 test. Jeffrey read my theory about the 10-second delay, which I do appreciate. Why there was a delay in the fuel switch transition back to run. It wasn't the pilots. They would have never delayed the movement of the switches back to run. It was a problem with the main battery standby power. Richard said the main battery standby power wasn't a problem, but he also didn't provide any solid technical reason to counter the evidence I've provided and what explains the delay in the fuel switches transition back to run and the delay in the APU auto start logic. In episode 215, I also provided a comment with additional evidence, more speculative, that supports a problem with the main battery standby power. Richard could be right and I could be wrong, but I think the fuel switches tell a story, and the APU and the emergency lights and the missing airspeed flight data recordings and how it all could be related to missing battery standby power.
Yeah, well, interesting point. And Doug, you could be right and I could be wrong. So, let's keep the discussion open. Um, I think there is evidence of multiple failures. The slow acceleration on the runway, the landing gear was not retracted, the rat was deployed, the smoke observed on takeoff, the maximum altitude achieved was only around 200 feet. The maximum airspeed achieved, I think, at the max was 186 knots IAS or 192 knots ground speed. And the captain's communication to the ATC, thrust not achieved. So these all point to a whole series of failures happening. And the rat is stowed in a compartment under the fuselage. It is held in place by a mechanical latch. The latch is released by an electrically energized solenoid. The solenoid receives power from the main battery, 28-volt DC, ensuring deployability even if there's a total AC power loss scenario. And the backup to the main battery is the APU battery. But we pointed out the APU battery may well have had an issue. Once the latch is released, preloaded springs swing the rat out into the airstream, and aerodynamic forces then fully extend and lock it in position. In the event of a dual engine shutdown, where there's no APU started and generating electrical power, and no APU battery power, the main battery is the only source of electrical power to deploy the rat. So that's why I come to the conclusion the main battery was still working. In the event of a dual engine shutdown and prior to the rat coming online electrically, the main battery is also the only source of electrical power for the captain's instruments and displays. And I'm pointing out that there was no comment made of the captain losing his instruments and displays, which again implies the main battery was working. The dual engine shutdown and relight is, in my view, solid technical evidence of an emergency situation caused by an electrical or fuel failure or both. And the rat deployment and subsequent load shedding of the transponder is a solid technical piece of evidence of an emergency situation caused by a hydraulic or electrical failure or both. And on a Boeing 787, in the event of a forced landing on the ground, the standard operating procedure is to leave the landing gear extended. It helps to absorb some of the impact. And all of these facts align with the observations we've made of the Air India 171 crash. The only inference that we have made is that the electrical failure occurred at rotation, and this is probably due to water ingress. That's why we call it a plausible hypothesis.
Yeah, absolutely. Very plausible. Very plausible. That's terrific, Richard. Thank you very much indeed for answering those questions from our viewers and, of course, discussing in more detail the AAIB um, reaction to this, which really, in many ways, beggars belief, doesn't it?
It does indeed. And you would think they would leave the 91-year-old father to grieve for his son without piling on such accusations and insinuations without any backing evidence for it.
Particularly when there are so many mistakes in the preliminary report. And it's not just us saying that, Richard. Everybody who's involved in aviation says the preliminary report is nonsense.
Yeah.
I
And
suppose,
I think it was deliberately done, frankly. You can make excuses as much as you want for AAIB and incompetence, but when you add it all up, and then you see these actions of going and visiting the captain's father, and there are all kinds of insinuations leaked to the press. It just beggars belief, as you say, and the AAIB should act professionally and stop this
yeah,
nonsense.
absolutely. And if they have concrete evidence that they are right, well, then produce it. Produce it now. They can do it in a flash. They could simply say, here's the exact transcript, and the NTSB could release it and say, here's proof positive. But,
Yeah.
after the supposed fuel cut-off incident, the plane maintained perfect gliding. There was no, you'd think in a cockpit where one pilot is trying to commit suicide, there'd be tussles, there'd be movement, there would be the plane's wings going from side to side. There would be all sorts of things happening. Yet all we know, I mean, we absolutely know for certain that the engines were being relit and the plane was gliding, and given another 2 or 3 seconds, would have landed on a road, not a building.
Yeah. And it is quite clear that the preliminary report is trying to paint a picture which is a cover up.
Yeah,
And the real issues are that what we should be focusing on. And you're absolutely right. If we had the flight data recorder data and the cockpit voice recorder data, and if we had the maintenance logs, then all of this could be easily cleared up.
yeah,
But we don't have that data, and
no,
so we're left in the dark.
we are. So, viewers, that's all we've got time for today. We'll be back tomorrow with to look at more of your questions on Air India Flight 171, and there's plenty for us to still get through. So please subscribe to us, please like us, please keep those wonderful comments coming, please keep those great questions coming. They do challenge us, and they're collectively moving this investigation, our global investigation, into this terrible tragedy forward. And we do appreciate them very much. So, Richard, once again, thank you very much indeed for all your work on this today.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
And viewers, please do tune in tomorrow. We do look forward to your company very much indeed. Take care.